Hi guys, so the next big concept that we have to learn about in trig is something called a radian measure. This is brand new. We have never heard of this word probably, but it should sound like another word that we have worked with before. What does radian kind of sound like? Hopefully you're thinking of radius maybe, right? And they are very related. A radian measure is another way to measure angles. What is the go-to method of, or not method, but what is our go-to unit of measure for angles? It's degrees, right? Degree is usually how we've been measuring angles. And the two of them, you can go from radian measure to degree measure, so you can like convert between the two measures. But radian measure we use a lot in trig, so we have to learn about it. Okay, so what is a radian measure here? So let's take a look. The radian measure of an angle, central angle, is when the vertex is on the center of like the origin. So the radian measure of a central angle is equal to the length of the arc. So this is the length of the arc. When this length is equal to this measurement, I have 1 radian. And really, this happens when my radius is a measure of 1. An angle of measure of 1 radian subtends an arc on the unit circle with a length of 1. So when my radius is 1, and when this is 1 radian occurs. Okay, this is a good visual of it. I really like it. So here, look. The angle made when the radius is wrapped around the circle. Really, a radian is about 57.29 degrees. Okay, so there is a conversion that we will be doing eventually. So let's take a look at this visual. Here's my radius. When I wrap it around and create an arc, I have 1 radian. Okay, let's watch it again. Here's my radius. It's the same length of the arc. Obviously, here's another radius. 1 radian is created, okay? And I could go between radians and degrees. So let's talk more about something called the unit circle, which is the biggest deal. And you need to draw a big circle like this in your notes because we need to make sure we understand, and we're going to become super great at drawing this unit circle 100 times. So let's take a look here. The radius of the unit circle is 1, always. Every unit circle has a radius of 1, so I could put a little 1 there, which measures the radius from this point to this point, which obviously means that this is 1, this is 1, and this is 1. Okay, what is the word that we use to describe the length around a circle? What's that word that represents the length around a circle? It is the circumference, right? Anybody remember the formula for circumference? The formula for circumference is 2 pi r. Okay, so if the length of the entire unit circle, and we're going to work with a circle, I want to figure out the length of this, right? Because that's what a radian is all revolves around, is the length of this arc. So part of my circumference, okay? So if my radius on my unit circle is 1, then I can say the circumference is 2 pi r. Well, my r is 1, so my circumference, 2 pi times 1, is 2 pi. That means if I start at 0, would be 0 degrees, but now it's 0 radians, right? If I go 1 time around, normally in degrees, how many degrees is 1 time around? 360, right? Normally, it's 360 degree angle, but now 1 rotation measures 2 pi radians. Okay, and we can say that this is 2 pi radians. Okay, let me get a little... 1 time around is 2 pi radians, but we got to break it up, right? Just like we do 0, 90, 180, 270, 360, we have to break it up with radians. So if 1 time around is 2 pi, what do you think halfway around is? Just 1 pi, right? That's going to be pi radians. what's between 0 and pi radians? Hopefully you're thinking like you just want to cut pi in half, right? And that's what we do. We say halfway there represents pi over 2 radians. What about down here, between pi and 2 pi radians? It's going to be 3 pi over 2 radians, right? It's cut right in the middle, right? 3 over 2 is like 1.5, right? So I have 1 pi, 2 pi, 1.5 pi. Okay, perfect. So those 4, just like we normally measure, we usually label 0, 90, 180, 270, 360. We want to become familiar with labeling it like in radians. 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Okay, I can go even further though, right? I can go and cut it in half again. And it's really good to keep it in these fractions. So what would be between 0 and a half? Or 0 and pi over 2? Between it is going to be pi over 4, right? And I could draw a line to represent this much is going to be pi over 4. And I want to do it all the way through my unit circle, all the way in all 4 quadrants. I want to figure out how much that is in radians. It's really helpful to get a common denominator, and I'm going to talk about that a lot, denominator, because we're better at looking at fractions when we have common denominators. And that's fine. So now that we're working with 4 as our common denominator, right? I just am working with pi over 4. How can I rewrite pi over 2 with a denominator of 4? I could say it's 2 pi over 4, right? These two, hopefully we can all agree that these two are equal. Pi over 2 and 2 pi over 4 mean the same thing, just one simplified. Let's do the same thing. Let's jump to pi. What would be another way to write pi with a common denominator of 4? 4 pi over 4, right? Because then those 4's would cancel and I would be left with pi. So what is right between 2 pi over 4 and 4 pi over 4? Halfway down the middle is going to be 3 pi over 4. And I can do the same thing down here. Let's get a common denominator. 3 pi over 2 with a common denominator of 4. And that's how I do it. Like 2 times what gives me 4 is 2, right? 2 times 2 gives me 4. So 3 pi times 2 gives me 6 pi. 6 pi over 4 equals is the same thing as 3 pi over 2. What is right between halfway down the middle, 4 pi over 4 and 6 pi over 4? 5 pi over 4. It's just a pattern, right guys? Then I can do the same thing with 2 pi. So if I have a denominator of 4, what's my numerator equaling 2 pi? That'll be 8 pi over 4. And simplify it, right? 8 divided by 4 gives me 2 pi. These two are the same thing. So, what's right in between 6 pi over 4 and 8 pi over 4? You got it, 7 pi over 4, okay? And that's the gist of the unit circle. All of these measurements can come out of the unit circle just like we would break down it in degrees, okay? We can divide the x and y axis into 4 parts, right? Just like we did. And then I can even continue to break it down, just like we would with degrees. Okay, and we're going to use this to practice drawing angles in radian measure. Before we were drawing, like the last lesson, we were drawing regular angles, right? Draw me 280 degrees, draw me 220 degrees. Now, I want to be able to draw an angle of 4 pi over 3 radians. Okay, so this was the video which taught us about the unit circle. Hopefully you have this in your notes. Watch the next video to practice how we're going to use the unit circle. Awesome job, guys. You got it. I know it's not the easiest thing, but the more we practice, the better you'll get. Awesome job, guys.